So the notion of the Great Flood that we find in the Bible became a very discredited notion in science, and by association with that, any suggestion of a great cataclysm in the past was seen as superstitious behavior, to be shunned completely by the squeaky clean, shiny new sciences, who must never take that into account. So any geologist who dares to propose a cataclysmic episode is up against that right away, that his colleagues don't want to go there because they're afraid that they're going to be accused of buying into Noah's flood or whatever.
That's so unfortunate.
Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you.
We cannot any longer trust the established model of the origins of civilization, since it does not take into account an extinction-level event right in the foundations. And that's why I say the house of history appears to be built on foundations of sand.
Well, it all makes sense. It really does. It's all shocking and stunning and fantastic, but it all makes sense.
It would make sense if something happened and people in those places in that region knew about it. They would all write about it. They would all have a version of those things. So one of the options for this is collective memory.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. We believe in the power of the good news and that Jesus has defeated evil and is king of our world. We exist to help you rediscover the supernatural focus of your Bible. We believe that the supernatural focus has been suppressed, and we're here to help bring that back into the light. We do that through incredible content creation. We have mashups and interviews with some of the best scholars featuring N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, and Dr. Michael Heiser. All of this content creation supports our nonprofit ministry here at Ring Them Bells, where we provide pop-up feeding centers for the homeless and also specialize in hurricane relief. If you haven't yet, please take a second. It only takes a moment for you, but means so much for this ministry. Subscribe and turn on the alerts, as this is the best way to connect with our channel. Many believe that an ancient apocalypse is recorded in the Bible and also the geological imprint of our earth. Did the biblical flood actually happen? Why are there so many similar flood accounts that stretch across the globe? Get ready, because the answers to these questions are going to blow your mind and break your paradigms as we explore the ancient apocalypse of the Bible. Together with top scholars and scientists, we're going to cross-examine the biblical account of Noah and compare it with scientific evidence and see how both are intimately tied to other ancient flood accounts. The ancient context of the biblical flood confirms, along with scientific evidence, that our world went through an ancient apocalypse that completely restructured our world and sent us into an ice age. You'll find out inside this video how the Tower of Babel is actually tied to the Ice Age, and we'll see firsthand how the Bible is in communication with the culture of its day to convey truth. Does the Bible describe a local or global flood? Was there more than one Noah? Is there an ancient apocalypse that happened that forever reshaped the planet that we live on? The answers are waiting on you. Stay tuned, my friends. The beginning is near.
Well, scholars have noticed for a long time, mainly since the late 19th century, when cuneiform languages were deciphered, they've noticed a lot of similarities between flood stories from Mesopotamia and the biblical flood story. There are a number of trajectories that scholars follow to think about this. One of them would be common memory. Since the Bible is an ancient Eastern Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern document, it stands to reason that it would have similar stories to other cultures in those regions about some event that happened in great antiquity. In other words, there's a collective memory sense here that it would make sense if something happened and people in those places, in that region, knew about it. They would all write about it. They would all have a version of those things. So one of the options for this is collective memory. Other options include, especially when you get into the chronology of who wrote what, when, and in relation to what Mesopotamian material the Bible was written. There was considerable debate in the late 19th century about whether the biblical writers borrowed or copied information from more ancient Mesopotamian sources. Practically all scholars in the field today don't use language like that, as though the biblical writer was sitting there at the table and sort of had writer's block and reached over and grabbed a cuneiform tablet that happened to be Atrahasis and said, "Oh, great, I needed that. I'm over the hump now. I'm going to put this into my text." Scholars just don't look at it that way anymore. Whereas in the late 19th century, more of them were thinking along those things because that was the first time they'd been exposed to finding very similar flood stories in other literatures. Nowadays, most scholars would look at the material and they would have a keen eye on the differences. A lot of ancient astronaut people just completely skip over the differences. And the differences are important because it informs us that the biblical writer isn't just wholesale copying material. Rather, they're responding to the version of events that occurs in other literature, specifically to state their theological case about the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, getting credit for either the punishment of the flood or the resolution of the flood. They're responding to material, and they're tracking with it closely enough so that people living at the time would know what they're doing, that they're sort of setting the record straight, or they're producing and asserting their own theological claims about these sorts of events.
The top 5 reasons the global flood may have actually happened. Number 5, human documented history of the flood. If a global flood happened, you'd expect people around the world in ancient history to have told this story. And they do. Basically, all the people. The Chinese, the Native Americans, the Hindi people, the Sumerians, the Greek, the Aztecs, the Norse people, the story of Atlantis, and of course the biblical story, which is the account of the Jewish people. And their stories are largely similar. God or the gods were mad, and so they flooded the earth, while the hero of the story builds a boat and saved all the people and the animals. Number 4, geologic evidence of a catastrophic flood. There is evidence all over the world of unfathomably massive flooding. For centuries, science taught us that everything we see was the result of slow, steady processes over deep time, until J. Harlan Barretts took on the scientific elites and proved the Great Ice Dam flood of the Pacific Northwest. You can see the size of these small ripples that are the result of a local flood. And these pictures from the Camas Prairie in Idaho, which is in the path of this Missoula flood, has the same kind of ripples, but the scale is hundreds if not thousands of times larger. Everybody knows the Niagara Falls. This is the Horseshoe Dam, compared to the Dry Falls Formation in Washington, also part of this Missoula flood. The water at the Niagara Falls rushes over the edge at 200,000 cubic feet per second, while the water at this Dry Falls Formation ravaged through at 300 to 400 million cubic feet per second, hundreds of times more water than the Niagara Falls. Imagine the scale. And now that we know that these formations were caused by catastrophic floods, science is finding evidence of these kind of catastrophic floods all over the world, including 2 that are larger than the Missoula flood. Number 3, oceans underneath the Earth's crust. One of the first questions that comes to mind when thinking of a global flood is, where did the water come from? Which is a good question at surface level. But if you read the biblical account of Noah's flood, it's very clear where the water came from. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth. Job 38:8. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb?
Where did the water come from?
The Bible clearly says that the floodwaters came from inside of the earth, and scientists have potentially just recently found this water. They now estimate that there's more water underneath the earth's crust than above. How did the author of the Bible get this right over 3,000 years ago? Good guess, Moses. Number 2, the Ice Age. The fact that there was even an Ice Age at all provides strong evidence for a global flood. Why? We all have this idea of what the Ice Age was, the entire Earth covered in snow, but that's not the truth. The Earth was only about 4 degrees colder. However, up to 30% of the Earth was covered in ice, glaciers technically. Today, less than 5% of the Earth is covered in glaciers. So where did all the snow come from to cover 30% of the Earth? What do you need to form ice? Cold and water. If you only have cold, then you just have a cold age, not an ice age. Where did the precipitation come from? At the beginning of this last winter, Buffalo, New York experienced the most massive blizzard in its recorded history, when a lake effect storm caused 60 inches of snow to encase the city. And how did this happen? Freezing cold Arctic air moved south over the warm waters of the Great Lakes. The waters were still warm from the fall, and as the cold air passes over the warm water, it causes evaporation, precipitation. And in the Buffalo blizzard, this created a conveyor belt of snow, as the warm waters meeting the cold air caused the formation of the clouds and precipitation. And this can explain where the water for the Ice Age came from. Models show that if there was a global flood, this event would have created a tremendous amount of energy or heat, largely due to friction. This heat would have dissipated into, and of course, heated up the oceans, creating this lake effect phenomenon, but on a global scale. Number 1 evidence that a global flood may have actually happened, the fossil record. How is a fossil formed? When an animal dies, the scavengers almost immediately get to work on beginning the process of disassembling the formerly living thing. And this is just the beginning phase of its total decomposition, finished off by bugs, bacteria, and fungi. It's gross, but it's an amazing system for recycling organic material. Because of the efficacy of this recycling process, dead animals stand basically no chance at being preserved in any complete or articulated way. And this is why, in order for something to become a fossil, it basically needs to be rapidly buried by mud or sand, which helps to make sense of the fossils of animals that died while eating, giving birth, and that are found in death poses, arched back before being rapidly covered by mud, sometimes sand. So the very fact that fossils are found all over the Earth is compelling evidence for a global, rapid animal burying event, like a flood. It also explains why marine fossils, like whales and sharks, have been found in the middle of deserts and also on the top of Mount Everest, the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world. So what do you think? Did a global flood actually happen?
Okay, so now we've established that the flood narrative contained inside the Bible seems to be a part of a global report of an ancient apocalypse that happened on the earth long ago. When it comes to the question of whether it was a local or global flood, we must remember that the truth of Scripture lies with the original authors and their context. The world for the biblical authors did not include the Americas, Australia, or any other undiscovered continent. However, when the ancient authors used the word world, they were thinking of everything. We're going to pause and listen to Dr. Michael Heiser and also Inspiring Philosophy to see how they break down that the Bible itself is not requiring us to think of the flood as a global event. I think this point is important to emphasize, but I want to make sure to remind you that the biblical authors were telling the story of the flood from their Mediterranean context. Although they could not have known about these undiscovered continents, personally, I believe that they thought the flood encompassed more than just their known world. So although I somewhat disagree with what we'll hear from Heiser and Inspiring Philosophy, I think it's important for us to hear this out so that we understand that even if the Bible is not specifically speaking about a global flood event, the context that it provides for an ancient apocalypse is still in play. Personally, I think the authors of Scripture were trying to tell a story of a global event inside their limited context of the Mediterranean world. Let's listen to these next 2 segments and see what we can discover together.
This actually takes us into territory where, in one of the online courses I teach, the first assignment is always to do a word study on the terminology in the flood story. And students are assigned, I don't care what position they take, but the assignment is, can a local or regional flood view be defended exegetically, from the text. And so part of what I want them to see, what I want them to ask themselves when they go through that assignment, is really to think about context. Now, I say that to get us into the subject because I'd say the account presumes the known world at the time, which would mean it isn't global like we think of global. So it's not about taking certain parts of the description and saying, oh, the mountains, here, do they do this or that? Is this how people would have looked at mountains? Or look, it's just the world at the time is given to us in the Bible, and specifically it's given to us in Genesis 10. So really, one of the key questions, to approaching this question and just generally interpreting the flood account is Genesis 10 the correct context or part of the correct context for interpreting Genesis 6 through 8? And if you're not familiar with Genesis 10 gives us the nations known to the biblical writers. It actually lists them out. And you're not going to find nations elsewhere in the Bible that are found outside the geographical parameters. In other words, it's basically the world of the Mediterranean, a little bit maybe beyond what the Greeks knew as the Pillars of Hercules and all that stuff, into what is now Spain and stretching over toward, what is India, but basically the Mediterranean world, which includes parts of Africa, Middle East, and again stretching out toward, what might be the northernmost parts at most, of India or something like that. But that's the known world at the time. And so Genesis 10 lists a bunch of nations. If you plot them on a map, like you can get any Bible software, any study Bible, that this is the picture that's going to emerge. So the question is, should that chapter inform our understanding of how we read the flood account? And I would say, yeah, it should, because those nations are the ones that extend from Noah's sons that survived the flood. So I would suggest, again, I don't really care. This is on my list of issues that I have to muster interest to really care about whether someone is a global flooder or a local regional flooder. I don't really care. I only care when people tie it to salvation or someone's view of inerrancy, because I can go for a long time going through scripture. I could be standing in front of an auditorium full of people and just running searches and showing you the exact phrases in context where they cannot mean exhaustive totality. And then the question is very simple. Is it okay to take these instances of these phrases where they don't mean exhaustive totality? Is it okay to use them as the hermeneutical filter then for the flood account and argue for a regional flood? People would say, no, that's illegitimate. You can't do that. And then it's very easy. I could just say, well, of course I can, because of Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is not all the nations of the globe. It's all the nations that they knew, which is regional. Again, it's not difficult to argue for a local regional event and have a really text-based argument for that has nothing to do. I didn't even bring up science. I don't care what science says. I'm not a scientist. Doesn't amount a hill of beans to me. I don't use science as a hermeneutical tool. What I just gave you was text-based information.
We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a non-profit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.
Genesis recounts a great flood in the distant past, but a surface-level reading of an English translation implies the flood was global, meaning the entire world would have been covered in water. But is this really what the text is saying, or is a regional flood all that is being described? The idea the flood of Noah was a global event is a common belief among many Christians today, but it is highly rejected by the scientific community. Because of this, many Christians reject mainstream science, and many scientists say the Bible contains falsehoods. But I don't think this tension is necessary. The text of Genesis does not definitively say the flood of Noah was a global event, and could just be describing a regional flood. First, let's all be honest. There is not a person alive who can claim they take the entire account in every verse of the flood story literally. That is just impossible, and even global flood proponents have to admit many verses in Genesis 6-9 are hyperbolic. Genesis 6:13 claims that God said he would make an end of all flesh. But that is not true, since every creature in the ark survived, and so did all the sea creatures. Nor did God literally destroy the earth. Genesis 8:2 says the windows of the heavens were closed. But even global flood proponents realize they are not literal windows in the sky. Genesis 9:2 says, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth." But obviously this is not literally the case for every animal. There are several other verses we have to admit are hyperbolic. So there are no people who take the entire flood account literally. Thus we have to admit it doesn't necessarily record a global flood, but instead could just be explaining various events in hyperbolic and metaphorical language, like with these verses we went over. This can be seen elsewhere. In Genesis 41, it says, "All the earth came to buy grain from Joseph." But obviously the Chinese, Australians, or Mesoamericans didn't travel to Egypt to buy grain. Nor did Jacob. He just sent his sons to buy grain. So this is obviously hyperbole, to just recount that many people from the regional area came to Egypt to buy grain. In Genesis 14, it says the enemies took all the possessions of Sodom. So even the clothes in the houses? This is obviously hyperbole, to mean Sodom was ransacked, but they probably literally didn't carry everything out of Sodom and leave all the people bare naked. So Genesis contains several verses that contain hyperbole and exaggeration, and that might be all that is happening in the flood story. However, some try to argue that the flood account says the tops of the mountains were covered by 15 cubits, so this must mean the entire earth was covered. But Michael Heiser notes the word is used elsewhere for a hill and at times a mountain that trees grow on, and trees don't grow on very high mountains. So it could just be referring to the point of view of Noah, and he simply is noting all the high hills or mountains from his viewpoint in his local region were covered. If the flood was global, it is not like he would have floated around the whole earth to verify there were no mountains visible. Some also suggest that because the flood account uses the phrase, all the earth, it must be referring to a global event. But this is clearly not the case in other places in Scripture. Genesis 2 says the Pishon River flows around the whole land of Havilah. Does that mean every square foot of Havilah contains the Pishon River? The same is said of the Gihon River. But clearly in both cases, it doesn't mean the rivers touch every piece of that region. Genesis 13:9 records a conversation between Abram and Lot, and Abram says, "Is not the whole land before you?" It is clear they are not looking at the whole earth. The Americas or Antarctica are not before them. It is just a reference to the whole regional land before them. Again, there are numerous other places where this Hebrew phrase, used to denote the whole earth, doesn't refer to the entire globe. So just because this phrase shows up in the flood account, that doesn't mean it refers to the whole planet. What about 2 Peter? Many argue this epistle speaks of a global flood, but that is not necessarily true. In fact, 2 Peter 2:5 qualifies the flood by saying it came upon the world of the ungodly, which means it could just be referring to the world of the ungodly people at that time. Plus, the Greek word for world is used to refer to local or relative areas. On top of this, there are indications in the flood account that it was just a regional event and not global. Genesis 8 records that the ark came to rest on a mountain, and then in verse 5 it says, "And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Okay, so at this point in the story, Noah can see the tops of mountains in the distance, or maybe close by. Then Noah lets out a raven and then a dove. However, then it says in verse 8 to 9, "Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth." Well, wait a minute, I thought verse 5 said the tops of the mountains were seen. But in verse 9, it says the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. If this literally means the whole planet, the passage contains a contradiction. But if it was just a regional flood, and verse 9 is talking about how the waters had not receded from the region, which was the entirety of the flood, the passage makes more sense. The waters had not receded from the whole land, which was originally flooded, but the mountains in the distance were still seen. This also makes sense with something that is said after this, where it says, "The waters were dried off the earth." Okay, this obviously doesn't refer to the whole earth, because we still have massive oceans. But it would make sense if it refers to the regional area, and that the waters receded from that region, not the whole earth. Now, some global flood proponents respond to this by saying that when verse 5 says the tops of the mountains were seen, it refers to them being seen under the water. In other words, they finally became visible, but only below sea level. However, if this is true, and the water is still literally on the face of the whole earth in verse 9, that means in less than 7 days, the waters receded to an elevation point where olive trees can naturally grow, and olive seed germinated, and sprouted and grew the tree quick enough so that leaves could form, so the dove could find it 1 week later. This would be impossible short of a miracle, which the text never indicates. So adding these additional assumptions to try and cling to a global flood are just absurd. The text is probably just talking about a regional flood, and it makes more sense with what is stated in verse 5 and verse 9. Thus, because of this, I would suggest the text makes more sense in speaking of a regional flood, not a global flood. Michael Heiser also draws attention to what happens immediately after the flood, which is an account of the Table of Nations, which only covers people who live in their geographical region. They had no knowledge of tribes on Australia or any who lived in the Americas, so they only seem focused on what is taking place in their geographical region, which would contextualize the flood account. It was a regional flood, not something that extended to cover the whole earth. This fits well with Psalm 104, a psalm of creation, which explicitly states that when the continents first appeared, the face of the earth would never again be covered by water. So that would imply the later flood of Noah could not have covered the whole earth. Finally, John Walton and Tremper Longman note the flood account is ambiguous about who survived. Other than the fact that the entire book of Genesis uses hyperbolic and exaggerated language at times, as we noted earlier, Genesis 7:23 uses an ambiguous word to talk about those who survived in the ark. The English says, "Only those with Noah survived." But this is not the word you would use if you explicitly wanted to say only those in the ark survived. The word is actually a little ambiguous. To quote, the word usually begins a clause, so comparable examples of the syntactical construction in Genesis 7:23 are difficult to identify. It regularly functions either as asseverative or adversative. In either of those cases, however, the particle should have led the clause. In conclusion, both Hebrew and Akkadian texts are vague about the human survivors, which is no surprise since people would have only limited knowledge of populated areas across the known world. Thus, in conclusion, there is no reason to suggest the flood account necessarily must be understood as a global flood. The account seems to function within the local perspective and viewpoint of the original presenters, and would not indicate the flood was global. Thus, Christians can follow the science wherever it leads.
So we can see that the literary artistry of the Bible allows us to assume a local flood even with the global language used by the ancient authors. We can't expect an ancient author to understand what happened in South America or Australia, But what we can expect is the Bible to be in truthful conversation with literal and historical events that happened in our world. So many of us want to separate out science and the Bible because we believe that they are speaking different languages. As we'll see from the next following clips, the science of a worldwide flood can both help explain either a local or global flood. It's important to remember that the flood account comes right before the Tower of Babel. The flood event happens right before God disperses the nations and breaks up the languages of humanity. So by proxy, this is a story that all civilizations and nations would have took with them at the dispersion from God at Babel. The science of an ancient apocalypse and a global flood, when put beside the biblical narrative, gives us a full spectrum view into the reality of what actually happened. Let's explore this mystery together.
I've been looking forward to this podcast for a long time, gentlemen.
This is new information. This is new science that's been mainly published in the professional journals since 2007. It's very intriguing new information, but we cannot any longer trust the established model of the origins of civilization, since it does not take into account an extinction level event right in the foundations. And that's why I say the house of history appears to be built on foundations of sand.
Now, this hasn't been adopted yet, but is it resisted? Has mainstream?
Yes.
It is. It's being resisted.
Whenever you propose a cataclysm of any kind, it's a curious thing. I don't know whether it's psychological or something more sinister than that. But whenever you propose that and present evidence for it, you can be sure that you will be descended upon by a furious crowd of critics.
If we look here at the image, now this is not from the catastrophic flood we're talking about here.
Obviously.
But interestingly enough, this was a 100-year flood that happened in Georgia back in 2004. And what we had was a floodplain that got overtopped for the first time in decades, and it left these current ripples here. And I use this slide to show what we're used to on the scale of phenomena that we would normally see, this kind of phenomena.
So this is a normal, very large, major storm.
Yes.
That, makes sense.
This was Hurricane Ivan when it came through in 2004. It was, they referred to it as a 100-year flood.
Right.
So
this is a massive storm, but it's nothing out of the ordinary, really. It's just, it's rare. But
yeah,
huge.
It's rare. What you'll see here is, I've got a measuring tape here. You're going to see the wavelength is about 3 inches. The amplitude, the vertical height of these things is about 3/4 of an inch.
And so these are all, what we're looking at is all dried dirt that has
sand.
Sand.
It's been rippled. It's been carried along, swept along in this water that was over this floodplain, which was 2 feet deep. Carried along, and as the water declined, it deposited this sand and then rippled it as the final stages.
And we're looking at this what year? How long after the storm was this?
This was a week or two after the storm, because within a month this was all obscured by wind and everything. So now, just so you've got this by comparison, we'll go to this. This is what Graham was just talking about, Camas Prairie. And what you see here is there's ranches out there, and you've got this 10-mile long field of these gigantic ripples. And if you look up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you can see some of these ripples. They're, like Graham said, they're 100 to 300 feet in wavelength, and they're up to 50 feet in amplitude. And the water that flowed through here that deposited this was over 1,000 feet deep.
So this is fractal. You get it.
Exactly.
You get it in the small scale. In the first image, Randall showed the same phenomenon there with a flood just 2 feet deep, and then we come to this humongous testimony.
It would seem that this would be something that a lot of mainstream scientists and archaeologists would be extremely interested in. Like, why would they try to ignore something like this?
The first thing they've tried to do is to get rid of it. This is often the case where new information emerges that contradicts established theories. And it's a strange phenomenon in science, because we like to think of scientists as rational and reasonable people. But the fact is that when you get very committed to a particular model, to a particular idea, I think you start to connect your own personality to it. And any attack on that idea becomes an existential attack on you yourself.
How sad.
And it is sad because again and again what we see is the new facts being dismissed because they don't fit the existing theory, where in fact what we should be doing is modifying the existing theory to explain the newly discovered facts. And this is a problem in the whole history of science. But today, things have changed, and what I see is the archaeological mainstream in a state of denial about this information. They just don't want to recognize it and absorb it, but they're going to have to recognize it. It's going to be forced upon them, whether they like it or not.
It's so sad because you count on these people to distribute the information, but their egos get involved in things, and if you've been teaching something for a long time, then it turns out you gave out master's degrees on things that were completely incorrect.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's got to be
and
very hard.
Something else, although this sounds a bit conspiratorial, I think the existing view of history is part of a mind control system in our society. It's something that we're presented with, that we take in with our mother's milk, and we're never supposed to question. I think if you control the past, you do actually control the present and the future as well.
So, but you mean if you have an absolutely established narrative that you're teaching and you're unwilling to look at any possible variations to that, you're saying, like, almost from an authority position, we know what happened and we know where we're going.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
if you say, hey, we don't know what happened, then it's, well, then who are you to tell us where we're going?
Exactly. And it starts to raise questions over everything, actually.
Right.
The scientists that have been in the opposition have been in the forefront of pushing this scenario of human-caused mass extinction and blaming the extinction of the great megafauna that died out 12,000 years ago on human hunters, which, again, we talked about that, and I consider that ludicrous, that Paleo-Indian hunters using spears are going to cause the extermination of 10 million woolly mammoths before they could even reproduce, along with 120 other species of megafauna.
Well, 65% of all mammals in North America were wiped out somewhere around that time, right?
Wiped out.
Mega mammals. Which is over 100 pounds in body weight, essentially.
Yeah.
Actually, more, like 75%.
75%.
75%.
And it was almost instantaneous, right? I mean, it was over a course of a very short period of time that
Very
they were
short
wiped
period
out.
of time.
Ooh, that gives me goosebumps. A single afternoon, all over the world, everything changes forever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I'd like Randall to address this issue of continent-wide wildfires, because we do see this in the stratum, that when you get this superheated ejecta coming down on ancient primal forests, consider the effect.
This is Murray Springs, one of the Clovis sites, and this is what was known as the black mat layer.
Where's Murray Springs?
It's in Arizona. And it's southern Arizona, and it's near the Clovis site, which is New Mexico.
That's the Clovis impact site?
Well, no, the Clovis site was where one of the first places in North America where human remains were found in association with extinct megamammals, such as woolly mammoths. And it's just outside of Clovis, New Mexico. And many of these Clovis sites, and there's been over 50 of them around now documented over North America, I think about 2/3 of them have this black mat layer, which shows up very clearly in this image. Now, that black mat layer is black because of the considerable amount of carbon soot that's in it. So in other words, right there, that's the evidence of your wildfires, is that this blanket of soot over the continent that left this black mat layer. And below that black mat layer, you'll find extinct megamammals. Like here, you see the yellow arrow there points to the black mat layer. Now, if you look up, you'll see how it's more buff colored. That was the color of all of this, but the soot that was in that black mat layer has dispersed and colored the other adjacent layers. But you'll notice the bones below are the bones of extinct mammals. The bones found above it are extant or still existing mammals. And that layer separates these two domains of extinct mammals and extant mammals.
Just a very clear line.
Yeah, and you can see it shows up so clearly right.
To people who are listening to this, when we're looking at the original image that Randall showed, it's almost like an Oreo cookie. Like there's just a clean line, and then there's the white filling underneath. I mean, it is as clear as day. God.
Now,
this
at the
perspective
base,
is so difficult in this.
It's a difficult perspective.
Because there's numbers that you guys are throwing around and there's concepts that you're throwing around that I have to pause when I go, wait a minute. I got to try to fit this in somewhere. But it's...
This is sitting 400 feet above the modern-day Columbia. So we know that the water was at least this high. Well, actually, it had to have been higher than this.
And how do we know that this rock just wasn't there? How do we know that it was carried by this?
Well, because it's not part of the bedrock. It's sitting on top of the land surface. Like all of these, if we look here, we've got some other...
Do we know where it came from? Do we know how far away it originated?
It's probably come from about 50 miles to 75 miles north of here. It's the type of basalt it is has been identified. I don't remember specifically, but when you travel over this land, you see these giant boulders just strewn about.
There's a place called Boulder Park. It's a tourist attraction now. You can go see it.
Yeah. And you can see there, the size of that. And there's, let's see.
Oh, my God. Yeah. So they just stand out, like, out of nowhere.
And this thing was transported almost 200 miles from, its likely origin was Mount Robeson, and we didn't get to this one. Mm-hmm. But this is evidence that the flooding was much more extensive than just the Missoula flooding. North American continental divide.
I should just jump in there and say that it isn't any longer controversial that there was gigantic flooding in the Pacific Northwest and indeed across the whole range just south of the ice cap. That is accepted now. But the very idea that there was flooding at all was hotly opposed for decades. There was a great American geologist called J. Harlan Bretz, who was the first to document the fact that there had been colossal flooding in that area. And he lived in the 1900s, 1920s. And because he suggested that there had been a cataclysm, of course, he was exiled by his colleagues. Eventually, his data prevailed, and he was awarded the Penrose Medal, the highest award of the geology in America, in 1976 when he was like 96 years old.
That must have sucked for him.
And he said then, he said, all my enemies are dead, so I have no one left to gloat over.
That's what he said?
Yes.
Oh, my God. But it's so disturbing to me that it works like that.
Yeah, it works like that. So
they're demonized.
But what happened, you see, was Harlan Bretz was convinced from the beginning that he was dealing, and this is a very experienced field geologist, that he was dealing with a single humongous flood.
Randall, what is this crazy image you're showing us?
Well, this is actually out of a 19th century text when before catastrophism had been completely exorcised from mainstream geology. And this was Louis Figuier, I think was his name, who speculated that the ice sheets over northwestern Europe had catastrophically melted down. And he had an illustration in his geology text which perfectly captures how these large erratics are actually being transported aboard these icebergs. And you can see the scale of the thing. And this is the kind of, you see whole forests are about to be washed away here. We've got some this was a place that Graham and I visited here, which really spectacularly embodies this whole phenomenon. This is known as Dry Falls Cataract. And it's about 5 miles wide. And I'm going to show you ground photographs and a couple of aerial photographs of it, so you can kind of get the scale of the thing. Now,
the great thing is anybody can go there. Yeah. This is on the land. It's ours to look at. We can all go and see this. It's an amazing trip to see it.
You could go there, Joe. They would let you in there to see this. Now you'll notice that there's a series of these alcoves here that these horseshoe shaped.
We're back on the image of Dry Falls.
Back on the image of Dry Falls, exactly. And at some point, somebody's going to be able to see these images, right?
Yeah, well, people could go and Google them online, but they'll see them right now on YouTube if they watch the YouTube version of the show.
If they see the YouTube, okay. So here's a typical Horseshoe Falls of Niagara, which is a modern receding cataract. And this horseshoe shape is very typical of the way water will erode bedrock. Because water flows faster in the middle of the stream, therefore it erodes faster in the middle and not so much as you get towards the margins. And so it creates this classic horseshoe-shaped profile. And that's what we're seeing here at Dry Falls. Now, this is just one of the alcoves, of about half a dozen of the alcoves that we saw in the map of it.
In other words, this is a monstrously big waterfall.
Yes. Now,
dry today.
Just off to the left of the picture is where, actually, and there's a photograph in Graham's book taken from Let's go back. We skipped over it. There it is. This is the viewpoint, and this is Horseshoe Falls of Niagara superimposed on Dry Falls, so you can get a sense of the scale.
So Niagara Falls is a tiny, tiny little thing by comparison with this ancient fossilized waterfall. Dry Falls between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee in Washington State is the result of flooding.
What?
Yeah. And
for people, try to explain this for people that are listening, because it's probably 10 times bigger plus.
More than that.
How many times bigger?
It's 2.5 times as high. And, well, figure this. The discharge of the Niagara River over the falls is a couple of 100,000 cubic feet per second maximum. The discharge over Grand Coulee was somewhere between 300 and 400 million cubic feet per second, or in other words, somewhere between 10 and 20 times the combined flow of every river on Earth flowing all at once. And the height of this scarp face here, this cliff, is about 400 feet.
Oh my
the
God.
water coming over was about 400 feet deep. So if you were here witnessing this at the peak of the flood, you wouldn't in fact even see a waterfall. What you would see is this massive 10-mile wide turgid river choked with icebergs and debris and whole forests
And that
had
river
been
is
ripped
Randall
up.
flowing at what, 60, 70 miles an hour?
60, 70 miles an hour. What you would have seen here was just a bump in this flood. And then only at the latter stages of it would it actually have been a waterfall. As the water source was dissipating and as the water was declining, you would have the final stage of it being a waterfall. Then eventually the waterfall stopped. And what you have today is this fossilized feature of this massive. And this is only one of about a half a dozen. See, here's the problem. Geologists haven't been focused on catastrophism. What they've been doing, they work for the government, they work for the oil companies. They're more interested in what's down below, the natural gas, the oil and
That's
stuff.
where the money is.
There's another point. There's another point I'd like to add to that, Randall, as to why geologists are not focused on catastrophes. Geology is a science, and science, in effect, defined itself as being different from religious superstition. So the notion of the Great Flood that we find in the Bible became a very discredited notion in science, and by association with that, any suggestion of a great cataclysm in the past was seen as superstitious behavior, to be shunned completely by the squeaky clean, shiny new sciences, who must never take that into account. So any geologist who dares to propose a cataclysmic episode is up against that right away, that his colleagues don't want to go there because they're afraid that they're going to be accused of buying into Noah's flood or whatever.
That's so unfortunate.
But it's true, and this is the problem. So there's catastrophism and uniformitarianism, and the prevailing dogma in geology is the uniformitarian dogma, which is basically to say the way we see things in the world today, that's how it's always been. It's never been any change.
Well, it all makes sense. It really does. It's all shocking and stunning and fantastic, but it all makes sense.
I think it does make sense, and I think it's it's something. It's part of the human heritage. It's something that we all have to get to grips with. Again, this is one of the things I find encouraging about developments in the world today is that more and more people do appear to be thinking for themselves. You know, there was a time when we took the word of specialists. Dr. X or Professor Y said this, it had to be true. That was the first argument, was the argument from authority. The authorities say this cannot be so, therefore it is not so. And a lot of people just bought that. What's changed, I think, in the last 20 years is that subservience to authority has gone away. It hasn't gone away completely, but we don't trust authority anymore, rightly and properly, because we've been lied to by authority figures, and we know they lied to us, and we saw the evidence.
So this must have been just an absolutely enormous event when it happened, and really sudden.
Unimaginable, and human beings lived through that, and it changed everything. They're called extinction level events. These global cataclysms wipe the slate clean.
Now, the Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each. Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand. Well, maybe if you're just at ground level, that will do. But when you're 350 feet above the ground, as you are in the King's Chamber, that won't do at all. I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely. Not entirely completely because there were survivors, but removed most of it. Randall will tell you, sea level rise, it creates a powerful high energy zone.
I mean, imagine your sea level rising at 3 or 4 times at least faster than we've seen rise in the last century. And within there, juxtaposed are these episodes of very rapid sea level rise. So you're talking about a very energetic intertidal zone. And anything that's there, short of large megalithic blocks, is going to be utterly obliterated by the time the process is through. And I think that this is one of the things that, the archaeologists and the prehistorians, people are looking at that, have failed to take into account the severity of these events we're talking about. Because the question always is, where are the artifacts? Where's the pottery? Where is the evidence that this civilization existed? And I have 2 responses to that. One, you don't realize the extent of the total remodeling of this planetary surface that took place. And it completely obliterates it. And then a short while later, you drop another one on the same place. What's going to be left? And then 10,000 years, 20,000 years goes by. What are you going to find? What are you going to look for? It's going to be just rubble that gets reincorporated just into the geological stratum, and it's going to be very difficult to differentiate, for example, from what's called a conglomeratic rock, which is basically where you have just a huge jumble of broken rock cemented together, right? Now, within there could be all kinds of stuff that's not even recognized as being artificial in the sense that humans had anything to do with it.
Basically, it comes back to the idea, which has been around for a long time among those who do, for example, grant to the flood myths this idea that there could be a literal or a historical event behind them. Of course, what it always does is becomes a regional event. Oh, there was this really bad flood in the Tigris or Euphrates River, and somehow that became this myth that the whole world was destroyed, and Utnapishtim or whoever it might have been in that particular myth built an ark, brought the animals on. This was seen as the precursor to the Noah story. Then, of course, you find that these flood myths are all over the world, right? So how do you explain that? I mean, so how do the reductionists explain that? When I say the reductionists, I mean those who are, basically purveyors of the orthodoxy, which is that these were just regional events. Well, it's interesting that when you read the details of these regional events, and then you have this amazing correlation, where you have Native American traditions where there's a great flood, and the survivors do so because they built a great canoe. And the term is a great canoe. Okay. Well, then the standard explanation would be, they heard that from missionaries, and then they grafted that into their religious tradition. And look, certain things are just so transparently BS that even without the documentation, you can still recognize that it's BS. But when you start looking at some of the early explorers and people particularly like George Catlin, who, he was the Indian artist. He wrote the book Last Rambles among the, I forget the exact name, Last Rambles, I think, and then it was subtitled, amongst all the Native American tribes. And interestingly, he visited over a period of whatever decades, like 100 different tribes. Reported the same thing. He said, and I'll pull up this quote at some point because it's such a great quote. And it comes right at the end of his book, which was about what he learned about the cultures of the native peoples in North America and Central America. And he said, well, there's a whole diversity of traditions and languages and beliefs and stuff, but there is one thing that is consistent among every tribe he visited. And that was their belief that they were descended from ancestors who survived a great catastrophe that wiped out everybody else, basically, right? So you see parallels in the so-called New World and you see in the Old World. And the explanation that it was a diffusion process, that the missionaries came over, told these stories, the native peoples were so impressed by it that they said, hey, let's modify our religion to, graft this in because it's so interesting. No, what happened when they came over and told those stories, the native people said, well, we have those stories already. You see, yeah, we know those stories. Our cultural ancestor was so-and-so, Manny Bozo or whoever it might have been that survived the Great Flood. So the thing is now we have to look at it, and here's, I think, the perspective. You have on the one end of that, you have the skeptics, the reductionists, who basically try to explain it away by saying, oh, it was just, it was, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, there was a big flood one year, bigger than normal, 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And now they're still telling the stories about it. It became, exaggerated into this, much, much bigger thing through the retelling, because it kept getting told and retold and retold. Each time it got retold, it got bigger. It got more impressive, right? Until it finally came the whole world, right? But really, originally, it was just a bad flood that, flooded the Euphrates Valley, but had nothing to do with somebody living up in Europe or in Asia or North or South America, right? Well, the thing is, though, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the evangelical Christians who don't need any scientific explanation, who've accepted in toto the model of the universal flood, and all it requires is just the supernatural intervention of the Lord God Almighty. It doesn't require any scientific explanation.
So now, as we move to our last few segments, I wanted to pause and focus on an interesting theory going over the Ice Age and its connection to the Tower of Babel. We've learned that a global flood would provide the necessary elements for the well-documented Ice Age that took over our planet. Our last segment will come from the Why Files and is the nail in the proverbial coffin of understanding the truth that our Earth went through an ancient apocalypse. As we'll explore, the case may be that we have more than one Noah and more than one Ark on our hands. But before we get to that, let's explore the fascinating connections between the Ice Age and the Tower of Babel.
See God's creation, including humans going through the flood, but these creatures are saved on the ark. 2 of the unclean, but 7 of the cleans. Mm-hmm. So the Ice Age is the mechanism for an Ice Age is the flood. Okay. Because why? Because you have it's all based on water mechanism, and so we can measure the Earth's magnetic field. We know that there's been a magnetic field reversal. And so when this magnetic field happens, so they recorded it in tree rings in New Zealand. I mean, this is all in published studies. But we see that this sudden change in magnetic field precipitated by the Noahic deluge brought on the Ice Age about 500 years, according to Michael Ord's model, about 500 years after the flood. Okay. And because of this, the precipitation that's falling in the northern latitudes comes down as ice and snow. In the lower latitudes, it rains. So yes, there is the flood, but there's also other things happening. We have meteor strikes. We have the Younger Dryas event. Temperatures are dropping globally at least by 30 degrees. The world's oceans during this time period drop between 200 and 400 feet. It forces migration of people. People are scattering. So when the Tower of Babel happens. It's a confounding of the languages, but the Ice Age hits them, and it forces them to disperse. Because of that, you don't have the animals and the greenery and this fertile crescent anymore. It's not fertile. This is an abandonment of even water issues. They are having to move to survive, and so you go with the people that you can speak with, and they can understand you. But this whole thing changes again in the Younger Dryas event. So the Ice Age animals come into this because we see mammals, mastodons, dire wolves, saber-toothed tigers, three-toed horses, camels, all being buried together.
Those giant sloths,
yeah, all together. You know, you know, there's a site in Colorado that these animals are all buried together at over 8,000 feet in elevation in Colorado. Why and how? We have another site in Waco, Texas called the Sudden Death Site, the Mammoth Waco Sudden Death Site. And these are mammoths that have been suddenly buried. We see one adult mammoth that is raising up a juvenile mammoth on its tusk as they were being buried, trying to keep it up out of the mud.
Wow.
And they're buried in with camels, three-toed horses, saber-toothed, things like this. Mm-hmm. So we see a record of what geologists call a Pleistocene extinction event. So these animals get wiped out. Why? Because the ecology of the earth is changing again. And so we see this all around the earth.
Dramatically.
Very
quick.
dramatically. I mean, in the northern latitudes, in Siberia, these mammoths are flash frozen. We see temperatures of like minus 175 degrees Fahrenheit. They're instantly frozen. But that environment was not a frozen wasteland like it is now. It was a tropical environment. And we know that because the evidence of the fresh vegetation that they ate, the bacteria and things that are still in their stomach, they're not fossilized, they're mummified, really. And so that these Ice Age animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, all these animals that we talked about were suddenly wiped out. And this is a result of the flood. So we have the flood, then we have the Ice Age happening. The Ice Age lasts anywhere between 500 years to 1,000 years. Probably a rough estimate is maybe 700 years. So 700 years of time, or 1,000 years, which is exactly what the Younger Dryas model predicts.
And explain Younger Dryas for those of us who.
Yeah, so the Younger Dryas event is basically just a terminology that the planet temperatures dropped, the ocean levels dropped, and this extinction event happened in the Pleistocene. This is all the animals that we talked about. Okay. In Clovis, New Mexico, there's an archaeological dead zone. We see evidence of habitation, then all of a sudden we don't see anything. And it's just like, where did they go? This is because this was a global event. This happened. This impacted everybody on planet Earth. So,
and I've always heard of the Younger Dryas as including like meteor strikes. Lots of.
Well, there's
part of it.
Yeah, there's not only meteor strikes that's happening. There's catastrophes. There's some 10,000 volcanoes.
Gotcha.
Exploding all over the earth. That's a result of Noah's flood.
Okay.
And so we see these mega sequences coming in, and so the flood has happened. We have this thought process of it just all happens at once. It happens over a course of time, but these mega sequence events happens in stages. So we have these events that are burying. They are burying the marine life first. So this is why we get fossilization in ocean creatures. Mm-hmm. Fish, they're in life action. Fish eating other fish, giving birth. We find them in the death pose. They're arched backwards. We even see dinosaurs in the death pose. I've excavated parts of 15 different dinosaurs, and they've all died in a catastrophic burial due to water. And so in some cases we see that they're still in a death pose. They're arched backwards because they're being asphyxiated. So this is all a result of Noah's flood, and the layering event that happens is because of Noah's flood. The fountains of the great deep bursting forth, jettisoning water 200 miles up in the stratosphere. Now it rains from below, but from above. And so we see this flooding of the earth happening. But because of all this, we have the fossil record, the geological record, which is a record of stasis. That geology that we see is not over millions of years of time. There's an explosion of life in the Cambrian at the very bottom, and then it's a record of stasis, which means it is a record of death from after the Cambrian up, all the way up to the top.
The story of Noah and the flood is primarily found in the book of Genesis, chapters 6 through 9. This narrative is one of the most well-known in the Bible.
So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth.
But the book of Enoch tells it a little differently. First, it's Uriel who tells Noah about the flood, not God. And the intention of the flood is not to destroy all humans. According to the book of Enoch, the primary targets of the great flood are the fallen angels known as Watchers and their human hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. Most humans will also die, but this is considered necessary collateral damage. It's the only way to reset creation and wipe the slate clean. If some humans survive, great. If they don't, it doesn't matter. Only Noah matters. Noah was given specific instructions on how to build the ark and survive.
Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark, and make lower, middle, and upper decks.
This is a big ship, longer than a football field, almost 100 feet wide, and taller than a 5-story building. It would need to be big, because Noah had an additional responsibility.
Then the Lord said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth.
At this time in history, there were well over 1 million species of animals on Earth. Obviously, these wouldn't fit on the ark, but there are explanations and interpretations. The biblical interpretation is that Noah wasn't saving every breed of animal, just the type. With Noah, his family, and the animals safely aboard the ark, the flood began.
On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
As the waters raged over the earth, anyone not on the ark drowned. It took 5 months for the water to recede, and another 5 or 6 months for the land to be dry enough to leave the ark. Noah and his family and the animals were on the ark for a full year. Many Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe the Great Flood is symbolic, an allegory to serve as a warning to mankind: be righteous or be destroyed. Others take the Bible literally and claim Noah was a real man who built a real boat to survive a real flood. What if they're both kind of wrong? What if there was a flood, but the man known as Noah is known by different names in different cultures? The ancient Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh is the first flood story. Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea about a great flood. He builds a large boat to save his family and animals from the deluge sent by the god Enlil. And Enlil was also Anunnaki. Right. In Hinduism, Manu, the first man, saves a fish who later warns him of a great flood. The fish instructs Manu to build a boat, and when the flood comes, the fish guides the boat to safety, carrying Manu, the 7 sages, and the seeds of life. In Native American Ojibwe mythology, a great flood occurs. Nanabojo, a cultural hero, survives by floating in a boat along with various animals. And there is an Australian Aboriginal myth, Tiddalik. A giant frog drinks all the water in the world, causing a drought. When he releases the water, it causes a great flood. A boat is used to survive this deluge. The Chinese have the Gunyu flood myth, which cleansed the earth. The Inca myth tells of Viracocha, who floods the earth to destroy giants who have disobeyed his orders, sparing 2 to repopulate the earth.
Nephilim.
Could be. These stories go on and on. I specifically picked a few from cultures that are far away from each other, separated by oceans. In all, there are about 250 separate flood myths, but every story is eerily similar. For years, the similarities between these stories was considered coincidence. As people stepped forward to claim there really was a global flood, it was called pseudoscience. But as often happens, the only difference between pseudoscience and science is time.
I think that the evidence is consistent with what I will call a mega-scale pluvial event over North Africa. Most likely consistent with the Pleistocene-Holocene transition and the great flooding events that we know are well documented from other places in the world.
This is the Great Flood at the end of the Younger Dryas, where the ice caps suddenly melted and raised the sea level of the Earth by hundreds of feet. Anyone living near a coastline would be gone. Any settlements or cities below a certain elevation would be destroyed. The cause of this event is still being debated. Some believe a large asteroid impact or series of impacts caused the sudden melting of the ice. Another theory, the one I believe, is that a massive solar flare hit the Earth. This would cause the ice to melt everywhere at once and explain why flood myths exist in every corner of the world. Whatever caused it, it was a catastrophic event, an event of biblical proportions, literally. But there were survivors. Maybe not just Noah. Maybe there were many Noahs. If an asteroid or solar flare hit, there wouldn't be much time to prepare, but there would be some time. Maybe groups of people anticipated the rising seas and built boats. Or, as some theorize, and many myths say, a being came down from the sky and warned people of the coming catastrophe. Those who heeded the warning would get to building boats right away. Those that survived passed down the story to their descendants. There could have been arks all over the world.
Okay, so we've reviewed so much incredible information that shows how biblical authors contextually spoke of a local flood that was actually a part of a global apocalyptic event. The recording of this flood throughout ancient cultures across the globe helps us to see the true dire straits that the world was in after the flood and why God resolved to never punish the earth like this again. Both the biblical narrative and geological and scientific evidence point us to both a local and global flood that changed the world forever. Coming up in our next series, we're going to explore why God flooded the earth. The answer may not be what you think. We're going to explore the context of Genesis 6 and the book of Enoch and show how the justice of God's flood over the earth is directly connected to the Nephilim and the giants of the ancient world. Make sure you are subscribed and have your alerts turned on. We have so much amazing content coming your way. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. The beginning is near.